And we're going to be in 1 Samuel 18. If you have your Bibles and you want to turn there, I'll be there in just a moment. Just kind of setting up the context of what this is. This is right after David kills Goliath. This passage is right after David kills Goliath. And David was this shepherd boy, and now he had become known as a giant slayer. He was a relatively unknown shepherd boy. But as you can imagine, doing something like killing Goliath puts him on people's radar. Now he's starting to gain popularity. People are realizing this isn't just some son of Jesse, the youngest son of Jesse. And this shepherd boy saved the nation of Israel from being oppressed by the Philistines. Because what it wasn't the armies. The armies didn't fight each other at this specific battle. They sent their champion out, Goliath. And Goliath was anybody who chooses to fight. It's one-on-one, your best against our best. And the winner will rule over the loser. And so David, we know the story of David and Goliath. David steps out, he pulls his sling, he hits the giant, knocks him down dead, cuts his head off, just to show the world that God is who God is. And it delivered the people of Israel from having to be subject to the Philistines. So the people began to like him, and his popularity was increasing. We pick it up in verse 5 of 1 Samuel 18. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now at this point, there had been some time that had lapsed between the events of the Goliath battle, because we can see that Saul sent him places, and wherever he went, he was successful. So I don't know how much time had lapsed, but there was some time that had lapsed there. But then we're going to look back here in the next verse. It just kind of reflects back to the journey home and all the success that David had experienced. Verse 6, as they were coming home when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another, and as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. Verse 10, the next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Now, we can see Saul has some issues that he needs to work through. Saul's got some problems here that he really needs to deal with. And in fact, there are a lot of leaders that have been in situations, that not just Saul, but leadership in general. There are leaders who have been in similar situations at one time or another. Look, we're human. And most people in similar situations, or many people in similar situations, leaders want their followers to view them as strong. They want to be viewed as capable. You don't want to be viewed as a weak leader. People who are in leadership, no matter what level of leadership you're in, those of you in this room, if you're watching online, you want your followers to view you as strong, competent, capable. You don't want to be viewed as weak, as someone who is just on their way out the door. And in Saul's mind, David is a threat to that. David is threatening because what happened? Saul had messed up. Saul had messed up in his past. He did something that was self-serving, and then he kind of manipulated it and say, I did it for God. It wasn't really for me, it was really for God. And Samuel the prophet told him that the Lord had taken the kingdom from him. So in the back of his mind, he's just looking over his shoulder, always waiting for, the kingdom's going to be taken away from me. What's that going to look like? So David is now a threat to Saul's plan for his life. Have you ever heard that the phrase that says, it's not paranoia if it's true? David had been anointed the next king. Saul knew that there was another, and he was anointed in secret. Saul didn't know that he had been anointed. The text doesn't indicate that Saul knew that. But what we do know is that David was looking over, or Saul was looking over his shoulder, and here is this young man rising in popularity. Here is this person who took down the giant that even the king himself was not able to go and face, was not brave or courageous enough to go and face. And here's this kid who did it. So Saul is feeling this jealousy as this young man begins to rise in popularity, and he's trying to process these feelings. He's not really knowing how to deal with it. These are real emotions. These are emotions that we face today. We want to be loved. We want to be accepted. We want security and safety in our lives. We want to be successful. There's nothing wrong with that. I want these things in my life as well. I don't want to fail. I've experienced failure. It's painful. I don't want to fail. I want the same success. There's nothing wrong with wanting these things in your life. But at any minute when we feel threatened on these fronts, we become defensive. We put the walls up and we immediately become defensive. We feel like people are coming against us, and they may not even realize that they're being threatening. It might be that someone is coming against you, you perceiving it as an offensive onslaught against you or a position that you have taken or your authority as in leadership or whatever it might be, and they just, any kind of thing that you perceive as coming against you, it's an attack, walls go up, this is difficult, okay, we go on the defense. We see it in our jobs, we see it in our social circles, we see it in churches, we see it in our homes. At any moment, when someone threatens our acceptance, our love, our security, it's natural. We go on the defense. You feel someone moving in on your job at work. Maybe there's somebody who has invaded your tight-knit group of friends. You had a group of friends, and now there's this new person who's come in, and they're now starting to, it was the joke. I was a guy that I was kind of the funny guy in the group. And so if there was a new guy that came in the group and he was funny, I'm immediately like, whoa, hold on. No, I'm the funny guy. There can't be two funny guys. So I'm immediately like, I don't like this guy. This guy hadn't done anything wrong to me, but he's trying to be funny, and he told a joke, and he saw some observational humor, and he inserted that joke in there before I could get it out, and they laughed at his joke harder than they would have laughed at mine. Oh no. Oh, come here, man. But we get that way. Maybe it's someone who just questions you or dismisses your thoughts or your ideas, that they just, There's another old saying that we use, but I don't like it as much, not in this context. The best offense is a good what? Defense. The best offense is a good defense, and that's what we do. We throw up that defense, and when it comes to human emotion, there's not much difference between the two. Offense being offensive or being defense. You might say that you're not offended, but when you go on the defense, it shows. They go together. So Saul was this king, and from the outside perspective, it looks like he attacked David first unprovoked. It looks like, okay, David wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just kind of sitting there. He was just chilling. He was playing his harp. He was just sitting, over in the corner going. But it looks like Saul attacked David unprovoked. We can be passionate in our defense, in our idea, or our action, or our position, especially when we're right. I'm right. You don't come at me against me with this position, because I know where I'm at is right, or we perceive ourselves to be right. And when we're passionate, sometimes we can be misunderstood. Sometimes our passion will override our ability to formulate a logical or a reasonable argument. I found this out when I was working in city government. There were times when I got so upset at people, and my mindset was, if I could just explain to them what I know, they'll see it my way. When the reality was, they were never going to see it my way. It didn't matter. But when we get that way, when we get defensive, we can become overly passionate to the point where we're not communicating ourselves clearly. Just because you believe something so deeply in your heart doesn't mean that you can communicate your heart clearly. Emotions get in the way. You can try to explain your defense, and you can end up doing more damage to the situation because others may not realize the heart behind why you're passionate about whatever that position might be. And when we read this story in 1 Samuel, we can fail to see the heart behind King Saul. Saul's story is years. It reveals years of bitterness and resentment, and it didn't end well for him. We have the luxury of looking at the end of the story and seeing how Saul died on the battlefield and the difficulty in the final years of his life and all this, how this bitterness and this resentment just built up within him and made him a miserable person. But it wasn't always that way with him. At one point, Saul was chosen by God to be the first king of Israel. God didn't want them to have a king, but they wanted a king, and so he said, all right, I'll give you one. And he chose Saul, this man who was head and shoulders above everybody else, this man who was humble, so humble at one time that when it was time for him to become king, when it was time for him to be anointed, he was hiding in the crowd. He was hiding. Samuel was looking out. He's like, all right, here's your next king, Saul. Okay, Saul, where you at? But he was head and shoulders above everybody, so they pointed him out. He came up. He was a humble man at one point. He wasn't always that way. God saw potential in him at that point in his life. But just reading these events in the Bible, we can miss the emotions behind this scene. If I would have the ability to go back in time and speak to Saul on that day, he might have tried to defend his actions. He might have tried to see himself as the victim, and David is the one who was the instigator. David was the one who did this over there looking all ruddy and handsome, over there, just with that grin on his face like, haha, I killed a giant. You see, we never see ourselves as the villain, especially when we take one snapshot of time. When we look at someone when we're looked at in our most difficult moments, and that's the thing, Saul was king for years and years, and he was a very bitter man. But a lot of the narrative here is of this time when he was bitter, and we can't judge his entire life based on these moments here. So we can just understand. I'm not trying to redeem Saul here. That's God's job to do. What I'm doing is I'm showing you here why perhaps he would have felt this way. Because we don't like to see ourselves as the villain. Saul was living through his emotions at that time. And it's kind of funny. There's a little story we joke around in the family and some of the people who know. When I was in youth ministry, you deal with emotional teenagers. It's just a part of life. Parents who've raised them, you understand. You deal with emotional teenagers. When I was youth pastor, I didn't have teenagers of my own at the time, but there was this one particular member of our youth group, and sometimes she would get in her feels. Sometimes it was, and one time I don't know if it was me or somebody said something. It was like, honey, you're just so emotional. And she clapped back, I am not emotional. And everybody in the room heard her, was like, yeah, okay, all right. We have real emotions, and we can get into those emotions. Saul got into his emotions. We can be emotional towards coworkers and friends, family members, other people, church people, and if we're not careful, we can be offended by any of these people. And what happens is when we grab onto that offense, we can lash out. Back in verse 10, it says that a harmful spirit came upon Saul. A harmful spirit from God came upon Saul. And so when God sends a spirit, there's not a whole lot we can do, but that's not how it started. Saul was already built up long before that. By that point, he was susceptible to that because he had made the wrong decisions time after time after time. Saul had a choice before that happened. The harmful spirit didn't come on Saul until after the root of jealousy had begun to grow deeply. People were singing songs about David that just elevated him higher than Saul. And we can be in a similar position here, feeling like somebody else is encroaching on our territory. Somebody else is encroaching on my circle of friends. Someone else is trying to question my authority. And you can act with righteousness like David did, or you can react like Saul did. At the moment that you feel attacked, You fire the shot right back without even realizing what's going on in your heart, and you don't realize how the devil is manipulating you in that circumstance. He's using that pain. He sees that opportunity and sees the barb hit you right in the emotion. You've been hit right in the feels, and so what happens is you clap right back and do something, and it can catch us off guard. That snapback reaction to somebody, it can happen, and it can have a long-term scar on a person or a situation. I learned to be better at reacting this way. But there's some moments in my past that I am not proud of because of things like this and how I responded. One example, I was out to eat with some ministry friends of mine, and one of them, I'm convinced he didn't care for me very much, but he said something hurtful to me. And it was just kind of said as a joke, which a lot of times, spears come wrapped in sugar. So it's like, oh, look at how funny I am. But it was very cutting. And what I ended up doing was I clapped back at him. And one of the things that I learned to do, and I hate that it was something that that I was actually good at, I'm not proud of being good at it, was I could make people feel pretty bad about themselves pretty quickly. And I fired right back at him after he said this thing that made me feel bad and embarrassed me. I fired back a sharper criticism, but because I was so in my own emotions, I wasn't careful with my words, and I said some things that did almost permanent damage to an innocent bystander, to somebody who was a good friend of mine. But because I was so vicious with my words, it ended up hurting this other person, and there was collateral damage. I was the victim, but I instantly became the villain. And I didn't like to see myself as the victim or as the villain. In fact, it took years, or not years, it took about 7 or 8 months later before I was clued into just how much collateral damage had happened because of that. And how I was the villain. At that point in my life, I had all kinds of stress coming at me from different directions. I was dealing with insecurities. I was dealing with inadequacies in my ministry, and I exploded in that moment, and I hurt some people. It's what happens to us when we feel threatened. When we are offended, we lash out in ways that catch us off guard. It catches others off guard. And we respond in a way that, looking back, we're not proud of it. Is that just me, or is there anybody else in here? You've reacted in a similar situation. Maybe it wasn't exactly the same as that, but you snapped back. The key is that we have to recognize what happened and let God deal with our emotions before we let it happen again and we become a repeat offender. Because here, understand this. If you allow a negative action to repeat, it will eventually become premeditated. If you allow a negative reaction to repeat, it will eventually become premeditated. You've got to allow God to deal with your emotions. And if you react that same way over and over again, we can't push it off and say, I just overreacted. No, we had time after time after time the opportunity to give that over to God, to lay that burden down at His feet. So if you're choosing to carry that and then you react in that way, you can't act surprised anymore. Let's see how this plays out in Saul's life. In 1 Samuel 19, verse 9, then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul, and he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. And David was playing the lyre. And Saul sought to pin David to the wall with his spear, but he eluded Saul so that the spear stuck into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Stress seems to bring out the worst in people, right? Anybody else, understand how stress can bring out the worst in people? When the heat is turned up, the impurities rise to the top. People will see what you're made of when the stress levels up. And I want you to notice how each of these men are armed. Back in chapter 18, the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. David had his harp, and he was just over there playing his harp every day. That's what he did. He just played his lyre, played his harp. And Saul had a spear in his hand. chapter 19, verse 9, then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. In his house, he sat with his spear in his hand. And David was playing the lyre. The way you respond to stress is determined by your daily weapon of choice. What are you going to use? What are you going to hang on to? Are you going to hang on to a weapon, or are you going to hang on to worship? Whatever you choose to pick up that day, that morning, whatever you choose, it will determine how you respond. And if you're constantly offended and you're constantly threatened by so many people, you're probably carrying your spear all day, just waiting on somebody to offend you. You ever met someone like that, or you ever find yourself in that moment? You don't even realize you're clutching a spear in your hand. You're just walking around saying, oh, I wish somebody would. Try me today. I wish somebody would. I'll pin them to the wall. You may have heard the phrase that when you when you walk around with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Saul often held his spear in his own palace, in his own home. He held his, what was going to happen? He's surrounded by guards. What is going to happen to him in the security of his own palace that he needs to carry his spear? But he couldn't handle it. David used to play the lyre, used to play the harp, and it would calm Saul down. Not anymore. That didn't work anymore. Because he kept holding on to his spear. In 1 Samuel 26, we see that Saul, later on when Saul's on the chasing David, we see he's sleeping next to his spear. Again, he's in the middle of camp, he's surrounded by his men, and he's sleeping next to his spear. He was paranoid and he was obsessed. Saul even became angry with his own son in 1 Samuel 20. Jonathan and David had become best friends. They are legendary friends, soul friends. And Jonathan had seen how destructive his father's behavior had become. And so he's trying to help David. He tries to get his dad to understand. He tries to show him just how difficult he's being. He helps David to have an excuse not to be at dinner that night. And Saul gets mad because he was planning to kill David with his spear that night. And then Saul gets mad, and he's mad at Jonathan. We pick up in chapter 20, verse 30. Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman." That is an artful way of calling his mama something real bad. "Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" Y'all, he is being vicious here. He is firing verbal spears. He's so upset that he is cussing the mother of his own son. Verse 31, "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." Saul is trying to drive a wedge between this friendship, this God-anointed friendship between Saul and Jonathan, or between David and Jonathan. And he's accusing David of trying to steal what rightfully belonged to Jonathan by birth. Saul was trying to overturn what God had already said. It's not going to happen. Saul's plan is not going to override what God had already decreed. And that just made him even more bitter. It made him even more angry. But here's what happens when you don't allow God to deal with your hurt and deal with your pent-up frustrations. Verse 32, Jonathan answered Saul, his father, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him. So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. He tried to kill his own son with the same weapon that he used to try and kill David. If you go through life clutching your spear, you will destroy every relationship that matters. If you are constantly going through life with your offensive weapon in your hand, oh, I wish somebody would try me today, you're going to destroy good, healthy, God-given relationships. Because when you're constantly holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And sometimes the very thing that you're struggling against was put there by God for a purpose. David was put there by God to soothe Saul's troubled heart and his mind. But what if, because you're always holding a spear, that thing that used to bring you peace and comfort now causes you stress? Oh, it used to be the songs of David would calm him, but now every time he hears it, it just makes him more and more enraged. Or let's put it in a modern day context. You used to love it. Oh, it was so cute at the beginning of your relationship when your spouse would call and check on you and, hey, when you coming home, babe? Oh, hey. Hey, where are you at? Oh, I miss you. I miss you too. Years go by and now it makes you angry because you view them as being too clingy. Just give me some space. I just want some space. Stop checking on me. I'm deleting the Find app on my phone because I don't want you to know where I am all the time. Just leave me alone. What used to soothe you now enrages you. At one time, you used to like how frugal your spouse was because you were the spender and they were the saver, and it would worked out well. But now you're like, I can't spend money on anything without him just being so controlling over me. He's just trying to control me, or she's just trying to control me. She won't let me buy what I want. He won't let me do what I want. I just want to go get my hair done. My wife just got her hair done this week. Go get your hair done, babe. It's okay. Maybe it's work. You used to love it that your boss challenged you because you grew in your job. You were doing well, and your boss would come in and say, okay, this was good, but how about this? You know what? I didn't think of it that way. Okay. And then you grew, and you ended up doing well in your job. But now you see the boss coming, and what used to help you, now you see it as an attack. Why is he dominating? Why is he controlling? Why is he a tyrant? If he'd just leave me alone, I'd do better at my job. At one time, you were comforted, and you were encouraged when you came to church. But lately, it's been a struggle to get here. Lately, it's just been so difficult. The very thing you fight against could be the thing that God put there for a purpose. It's sad that Saul had someone like David at his disposal, but he couldn't see past his own insecurities. David was the perfect second. Yes, he was anointed to be the next king. But David was loyal. No matter how many times Saul tried to kill him, David would not harm God's anointed king. He had multiple opportunities to kill Saul. He could have, in that moment, pulled that spear right back out of the wall after it missed him, spun that thing around, and slung it right back at Saul and pinned him to the wall the other direction. But that was not what David was called to do. There were times, one of my favorite stories because of what it involves, he snuck up on Saul in the cave while he was pooping. Of course, I've liked that since I was a little kid because of that part of the story. He could have killed him in that moment, but it was not for him to kill God's anointed king. He came and took his items when he was asleep in the camp and took them up to the hilltop and shouted down, "Look, I could have killed you again." David was anointed to be the next king, but it would not come from his own hand. His heart was pure before God and before Saul, and Saul couldn't see it because he was constantly clutching his spear, because he was constantly living offended. Saul holding the spear, David holding the harp. One of these is an instrument of healing. an instrument of worship. One of these is used to inflict pain and death. One was used to deliver. One was used to destroy. One would soothe, the other would strike. Now remember, I don't want us to romanticize David too much here and think that David was just this peaceful person all the time. When it was time to go to war, David was a mighty, mighty man. We know David was not someone to be messed with. As a child, he killed a lion, a bear, a giant, and then whenever Saul sent him out to do something, he would come back even more successful. He slaughtered the Philistines so much, but that was for the enemies. When he would hold his harp, he would write some beautiful music. When he held his harp, he wrote songs with lyrics like, "Contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me." He would write things, he would play, and he was skillful. And he would write lyrics like, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." Difficult times, he would pull it, and I can imagine it was probably about this size, but he traveled with it everywhere he went, and he would pull it out of his sack and begin to play, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom then shall I fear?" And who could ever forget David's #1 bestseller, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In some of the most difficult moments of David's life, he picked up his harp and he began to write song lyrics. He began to write this beautiful poetry about God and for God. And every time Saul tried to kill David, David never picked that spear up and threw it back at him. Why? Because it's hard to hold the harp and throw the spear at the same time. You can't play the harp and throw the spear at the same time. When you are actively engaged in worship of the King, you will begin to see that you don't need the spear. It's hard to fulfill your calling and retaliate against those who you feel have wronged you at the same time. Church, we need to be better at dodging spears than we are at throwing them. Offense can happen at any time, and we feel justified in throwing stones or throwing spears right back. And of course, remember, David was skilled. I'm sure he had his sling on him at all times. So even if he didn't pick that spear up, he could have counter-rolled at the same time, pulling out that sling and loading it with a rock as he was coming. I could just picture it like a Jack Ryan or something. When he just one move, and then he comes up with that thing and whips it and just hits Saul right in the head and kills him right there in front of his family. He had the skill to do that. But instead, he clung to the harp and was faithful during his calling. This is a tough prayer, but it's one that we can all benefit from. God, teach me to dodge spears, not to throw stones. God, teach me to dodge the attacks, not to fire back. Now, when the enemy attacked from without, David threw stones. When the armies advanced against the kingdom of Israel, David went out and did what a king, what the captain of the guard does. But when it was from within, when it was internal, he dodged the spears. He picked up a harp and he praised God. You know, people will have bad days from time to time. It happens. But through the example of Jesus, we extend grace. Jesus washed the feet of every single disciple on the night he was betrayed, including Judas. Knowing that that man would betray him in just a matter of hours, he still served him and washed his feet. He said in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If ever there's a reason to extend grace to other believers, it's now. The forces outside the kingdom that are threatening, they're wanting to overtake what's going on. And if we are at odds within the kingdom, it will make it that much easier for him to do it. The screenwriter for the movie Braveheart said this: when I criticize someone, it's a quiet whisper in their ear. But when I praise someone, I shout it from the rooftop. That should help guide us. When you have an issue with a brother or sister, follow Matthew 18. Go to them, and I'll read that text in just a few moments, but deal with it one-on-one. But when you want to praise them, when you want to celebrate them, let it be public and affirming to everyone who is around. Shout it from the rooftops. Let someone know when you honor somebody else. World War I, which was not called that at the time, it was called the Great War, was one of the most gruesome conflicts in the history of the world. It would be eclipsed by World War II. But at the time, it was the most gruesome conflict in history. It would eventually claim 20 million lives worldwide. But on Christmas Eve in 1914, at Flanders Field, something amazing happened between the British and the German forces. It started with a report. The British soldiers noticed that there were lights in the trenches on the German side of the battlefield. They had each had their side. They had barbed wire on the sides of their trenches. And then in the middle, it was called No Man's Land. And there were dead bodies all over the place in No Man's Land. But they looked across on Christmas Eve and noticed that there were lights in the trenches. And they listened closely, and they could hear that the German soldiers were singing Christmas songs. And then they wished each other a Merry Christmas. They were shouting from each side, wishing each other a Merry Christmas. And then they began to sing back and forth as well. The German soldiers began to sing the German Christmas carol, the traditional German Christmas carol, Stille Nacht, Silent Night. During a battle, they began to sing about having a silent night. In response, the British soldiers sang the first Noel. After that, scouts from each side began to creep out of their trenches. They made their way through the barbed wire and went out into No Man's Land, and noticed that the other ones were coming that way, and they kind of met in the middle of No Man's Land, and each side agreed on a temporary ceasefire. Now, this didn't happen all across the battlefield or all across the war. It just happened in this one particular place. Some on the British side ended up setting up Christmas trees on the edge of their trenches. After a while, more soldiers began to come out and venture into No Man's Land. Rifleman Oswald Tilley wrote a letter home to his parents saying this: literally hundreds of each side were out in No Man's Land shaking hands. Communication was difficult. The British soldiers speaking English and the German soldiers speaking German. There was some ways that they were able to communicate. Some people were multilingual enough to do it. But there was one language that both sides spoke. And it was soccer, or what they called football. So what happened is, on Christmas Day, they had the ceasefire throughout the night. And then the next morning on Christmas Day, they began to play soccer. In fact, I've got a picture of it. Someone snapped a picture of these soldiers playing soccer during World War I in the middle of the battlefield. They even exchanged gifts. And you know, I'm not saying we need to exchange these gifts, but you give what you had. The only thing that they had to give each other was whiskey and cigarettes. They exchanged gifts, and this momentary peace gave them a chance to claim their dead and carry them back to their side. The fighting stopped momentarily in honor of the birth of the Savior of the world. That's what happens when you invite Jesus into your conflict. When Jesus is exalted, when he is lifted up, our offenses won't be. And when we cling to Jesus, it's hard for us to hold on to an offense. When we hold the harp, when we are engaged in worship, we cannot hold the spear. This past year has been, in many ways, the most difficult of my life, the most stressful. I know there's many of you that can say the very same thing. The outside attack has given way to people who really love each other, but they're coming at each other. And Jesus gave us a model for how to deal with that. He said in Matthew 18, beginning in verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and tax collector. When it says tell it to the church, that doesn't mean gossip. That doesn't mean, get on the phone and go talk about it. And unfortunately, that's the way that a lot of people have dealt with pain, is they did it the other way around. They were hurt, and they immediately started telling other people about it. Don't miss this. People get this wrong right here. What did Jesus say? Let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Well, Gentiles and tax collectors weren't accepted, so that means I get to cut them out of my life. You offended me? Peace. See ya. I don't want nothing to do with you anymore. But that's not the example that Jesus gave us. In fact, with the religious leaders, Jesus got himself in trouble because of how he treated the Gentiles and how he treated the tax collectors. So when Jesus says, let them be to you as Gentiles and tax collectors, what do we look to his example and see? What did he do? He pursued them. He ate with them. He loved them. He wanted to see them redeemed. When someone has harmed you, what do? You first go to them and say, hey, let's work this out. It doesn't work? All right, let's take somebody else with me. Look, I got some other people here. We really care and we want this to be worked out. It still doesn't work? We come before the church. And look, I don't ever want it to get to that, but if it has to, we can come before the church. If the offense is that big, it can come to me, it can come. But if it doesn't happen on that third level and they still refuse, treat them like Gentiles and tax collectors. Yes, Gentiles and tax collectors were on the outside, but Jesus pursued them and he loved them. God, teach us to cling to the harp and let go of the spear. Will you stand? That should be our prayer. Lord, when we're offended and hurt, help us to extend grace. Help us to understand. Help us to forgive. Help us reject a heart of jealousy like Saul. Help us to have a heart after yours, Lord, like David.